Nobody served Nathaniel Graves twice, the bartender whispered as another waitress disappeared into the employee hallway with trembling hands and ruined mascara, and somewhere beyond the velvet curtains of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, a single crystal glass touched polished oak with the soft finality of a judge's gavel. Rain painted silver rivers down the towering windows of Valmont House, blurring the lights of Park Avenue into long streaks of gold and ghostly white, while inside the restaurant the air smelled of old money, black truffle, aged bourbon, and tension so thick it seemed woven into the fabric of the room itself. Every Tuesday at exactly 8 p.m., Billionaire CEO Nathaniel Graves occupied table 7 near the back alcove beneath the dim amber chandelier, and every Tuesday the entire staff behaved as though a storm warning had been issued for the building. Servers traded shifts. Managers rehearsed apologies before he even arrived. Even the pianist lowered his volume after 8 o'clock as if the notes themselves were afraid to disturb him. "I'm serious," the bartender muttered quietly to the new girl standing beside the espresso machine. "No one laughs with him." Claire Whitmore glanced toward the empty table without saying anything. She was new enough that nobody had learned to read her silence yet. At 27, Claire had the calm face of someone older, someone who had already survived the kind of disappointment most people spent their lives trying to avoid. Her blonde hair was pinned neatly into a low bun beneath the soft restaurant lighting, and her gray eyes moved across the dining room not with nervousness, but with careful observation. She noticed the details other people missed. The slight crack in the marble near the hostess stand. The way the senior waiter adjusted his cufflinks every 30 seconds when anxious. The untouched second wine glass already sitting at table 7 before the customer had even arrived. "Then why keep serving him?" Claire asked softly. The bartender let out a dry laugh. "Because his monthly tab pays half this floor's salaries." Somewhere near the kitchen entrance, a young waitress hurried past them, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her uniform while avoiding eye contact with everyone around her. Claire watched her disappear into the locker room before looking back toward table 7 again. 2 wine glasses. 2 folded napkins. But only 1 chair ever pulled out. Strange. The heavy front doors opened before she could think further. Cold October air swept through the entrance alongside a tall man dressed in a charcoal overcoat darkened with rain. Conversations lowered instantly. Nathaniel Graves entered Valmont House without looking at anyone, yet somehow every person in the room reacted to him at once. He moved through the restaurant with the quiet certainty of a man accustomed to owning every building he stepped inside. Silver touched the edges of his dark hair near his temples, and his pale blue eyes carried the exhausted sharpness of someone who slept very little and trusted even less. The hostess greeted him carefully. "Good evening, Mr. Graves." He gave a single nod. No smile. No wasted motion. As he passed the dining room, Claire noticed something unexpected. Beneath the polished authority and the perfectly tailored coat, there was something hollow about him. Not weakness. Not fear. Absence. Like someone had removed an important piece from his life years ago, and nothing around him had managed to fill the space since. Nathaniel reached table 7 and paused briefly beside the empty chair across from him before sitting down alone. The pianist quietly transitioned into a slower melody near the bar. A server carrying sparkling water nearly collided with another employee trying to avoid being assigned to the table. The manager scanned the room anxiously before his eyes landed on Claire. Relief crossed his face instantly, followed by guilt. "Claire," he said carefully, straightening his tie. "You're taking table 7. Around them, the restaurant seemed to fall silent for half a second too long. For a moment Claire thought the manager might change his mind. His eyes flickered nervously toward table 7, then toward the hallway where another waitress had vanished only minutes earlier. But the dinner rush was swallowing the restaurant whole and there was nobody left to sacrifice except the new girl who still did not understand the rules. "Just keep everything precise," he whispered quickly. "Water glass never below halfway. He hates interruptions. Do not recommend specials unless he asks. And Claire," he lowered his voice even further, "if he becomes difficult, do not argue. Claire gave a small nod and picked up the leather-bound menu with calm, steady hands. Around her, the dining room continued its elegant performance. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath golden light. A senator laughed too loudly near the fireplace. Somewhere behind the bar, expensive bourbon splashed softly into cut crystal. But beneath the polished luxury, the entire staff was watching her. She could feel it. The hostess pretending to organize reservation cards. The bartender drying the same glass for the third time. Even the pianist glanced briefly toward table 7 before lowering his eyes back to the keys. Claire walked across the restaurant slowly, her black heels muted against the dark walnut floor. The closer she moved toward Nathaniel Graves, the more she understood why people feared him. It was not anger. Angry people were predictable. Nathaniel carried something colder than anger. Control. The kind that made everyone around him instinctively smaller. He sat alone beneath the amber chandelier with one hand resting beside a glass of untouched bourbon. Rainwater still darkened the shoulders of his coat, and the city lights beyond the windows reflected faintly in his pale blue eyes. Yet his attention remained fixed on the empty chair across from him. Claire stopped beside the table. "Good evening, Mr. Graves." Her voice was calm, low, professional. No forced cheerfulness. No nervous laughter. Nathaniel looked up slowly. Most people glanced at service staff. Nathaniel Graves evaluated them. His gaze moved across her face with quiet precision, studying posture, tone, confidence, weakness. Claire did not look away. Something unreadable flickered briefly in his expression before vanishing. "You are new," he said. His voice carried the smooth weight of old whiskey and exhaustion. "Yes, sir. How long have you worked here?" 3 weeks. A faint pause. 3 weeks, he repeated, almost to himself. Interesting. He closed the menu without opening it. The usual. Claire remained still for half a second. The bourbon braised short ribs with the rosemary potatoes and the smoked asparagus. For the first time, Nathaniel's eyes sharpened with mild surprise. Most servers memorized his order because management forced them to. But Claire had not been there long enough to learn the ritual. "You listened to the staff briefing," he observed quietly. "People reveal what matters to them when they repeat it enough," Claire answered. The words left her mouth naturally, but the moment they did, the nearby bartender nearly dropped a bottle. Nobody spoke to Nathaniel Graves that way. Not rudely. Not boldly. Simply honestly. Nathaniel leaned back slightly in his chair. His expensive watch glinted beneath the chandelier as silence settled between them. Somewhere across the room, silverware clinked softly against porcelain. "And what exactly matters to me, Miss Whitmore?" Claire glanced briefly toward the untouched second wine glass before returning her attention to him. "Consistency," she said gently. "You come here for something that is not on the menu." The restaurant suddenly felt quieter than before. Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Not anger. Something else. Recognition. He looked toward the empty chair again, and for the first time since entering the restaurant, the mask around him shifted enough for Claire to glimpse the loneliness beneath it. It lasted less than a second. Then the walls returned. "Bring the bourbon," he said coolly. "Neat." Claire gave a polite nod and turned toward the bar, but before she could leave completely, Nathaniel spoke again. "Miss Whitmore." She stopped. "Yes, sir?" His pale eyes rested on her carefully now, not dismissing her like furniture, not overlooking her like the others had warned. Studying her. "Do not assume you understand me." Claire held his gaze calmly. "I did not say I understood you, Mr. Graves." Another silence settled over the table, heavier this time. "Only that I noticed the chair." Claire expected irritation after her last sentence. Maybe even dismissal. Instead, Nathaniel Graves watched her with the strange stillness of a man hearing an unfamiliar sound from a distant part of his life. Then the moment disappeared behind the cold discipline in his expression. "The bourbon, Miss Whitmore," he repeated evenly. "Of course, sir." She walked back toward the bar beneath the weight of every eye in the restaurant. The bartender leaned closer the second she arrived. "What did you say to him?" he whispered urgently. Claire reached for the crystal tumbler without rushing. "Nothing dramatic. You mentioned the chair." "Apparently." The bartender stared at her as though she had walked barefoot across thin ice and somehow survived. "Nobody talks about the chair," he muttered quietly. "Ever." Claire poured the bourbon carefully. The amber liquid caught the warm chandelier light like melted gold as soft jazz drifted from the piano near the fireplace. Around her, conversations slowly resumed across the dining room, but the tension had changed shape now. Before, the staff had been waiting for disaster. Now they were waiting for something else. Curiosity. Claire returned to table 7 and placed the glass gently beside Nathaniel's hand. He gave a brief nod but did not touch it immediately. His attention had shifted toward the rain beyond the windows, where Manhattan glowed through the storm in blurred silver and white. "You are observant," he said after a long silence. Claire folded her hands loosely in front of her apron. "It helps in this job." "No," Nathaniel replied quietly. "It helps in survival." The sentence lingered between them longer than it should have. Claire noticed the faint shadows beneath his eyes now. The exhaustion there did not belong to a busy executive. It belonged to someone who carried grief for too many years without setting it down. Nathaniel finally lifted the bourbon glass and took a slow sip. Expensive watch. Perfect posture. $1 billion composure. Yet somehow the loneliness around him remained louder than anything else at the table. "Tell me something, Miss Whitmore," he said suddenly. "Why New York?" Most customers never asked servers personal questions unless they wanted entertainment. Nathaniel sounded different. Controlled. Analytical. As though he were assembling pieces of a puzzle without revealing the picture yet. "Work," Claire answered simply. "People move to New York for ambition," he said. "Or escape." Claire met his eyes calmly. "Sometimes they are the same thing." A faint sound escaped him then. Not quite laughter. More like surprise at hearing an answer he did not expect. At the neighboring table, a hedge fund manager accidentally knocked over his water glass, and 2 servers rushed toward the spill instantly. Nathaniel barely noticed. His attention remained fixed entirely on Claire now. It unsettled the staff far more than his anger ever had. "You speak carefully," he observed. "You listen carefully," Claire replied. Somewhere near the hostess stand, the manager nearly stopped breathing. Nathaniel leaned back slowly in his chair, studying her again with increasing interest. "Most people try very hard to impress me," he said. "You do not." Claire glanced briefly around the restaurant before answering. "Most people here are afraid of disappointing you." "And you are not?" Her expression remained composed. "I think disappointment usually says more about expectations than people." Silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Heavy. The pianist transitioned into an older melody then, soft piano notes drifting through the restaurant like distant memory. Nathaniel's fingers tightened almost invisibly around the bourbon glass. Claire noticed immediately. So did the older bartender polishing glasses near the back wall. The song had changed something. Nathaniel stared down at the untouched second wine glass across from him, and for a brief second his carefully controlled expression fractured with something painfully human. Loss. Deep enough to hollow a person from the inside. Claire recognized that look because she had seen it once before beside a hospital bed when her mother stopped speaking near the end. Some silences did not need explanation. Nathaniel finally looked back toward her. "Do you know this piece?" he asked quietly. Claire listened for a moment as the piano carried softly through the room. Then she nodded once. "Claire de Lune." Nathaniel's gaze sharpened immediately. "Most people here think it is just background music." Claire looked toward the pianist near the fireplace. "It is not written to stay in the background." And for the first time that evening, the cold distance around Nathaniel Graves shifted just enough for Claire to see the man hidden beneath the reputation. The rain intensified outside Valmont House, tapping softly against the tall windows like impatient fingers while the city beyond dissolved into silver haze and reflected headlights. Inside the restaurant, the warmth remained immaculate. Crystal chandeliers glowed like candlelight suspended in gold. Waiters moved carefully between tables carrying plates that cost more than most weekly grocery bills. Yet beneath the polished elegance, Table 7 had become the center of the room without anyone openly acknowledging it. Nathaniel Graves no longer looked through Claire Whitmore the way powerful men often look through service staff. He looked directly at her now, and somehow that unsettled everyone far more. Claire stood calmly beside the table as the piano melody drifted through the dining room. Nathaniel swirled the bourbon slowly in his glass before speaking again. "Most people only recognize that song because they have heard it in movies," he said. "You recognize the phrasing." Claire glanced briefly toward the pianist. "He is playing it slower than Debussy intended." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed slightly with interest. "You studied music?" It was not a question. Claire hesitated for half a second before answering. "My mother taught piano." "Professionally?" "At Juilliard." That finally broke the rhythm of the evening. Nathaniel leaned back slightly, studying her with renewed focus while the manager across the room nearly dropped a tray hearing the exchange. Waitresses were not supposed to casually mention Juilliard. "And now you serve short ribs in Midtown Manhattan," Nathaniel observed quietly. "Life changes key signatures without warning," Claire replied. For the first time all evening, something close to amusement touched the corner of Nathaniel's mouth. It vanished quickly, but Claire noticed it. So did the bartender. "Interesting answer," Nathaniel murmured. He lifted the menu again even though he already knew every item printed inside it. Claire realized then that the conversation itself had become the test. Nathaniel was not trying to order dinner anymore. He was trying to understand why she remained calm around him when everyone else folded under pressure. "Tell me something honestly, Miss Whitmore," he said. "What exactly did they tell you about me before you walked over here?" Claire answered without hesitation. "That you are difficult. And that no waitress lasts long serving your table." Nathaniel took another slow sip of bourbon. "Yet you stayed." Claire looked toward the empty chair again before answering carefully. "You do not seem like a man angry at waitresses." Silence settled heavily across the table. At the far end of the restaurant, thunder rolled softly beyond the skyscrapers while candlelight flickered against crystal glassware. Nathaniel's gaze lowered briefly toward the second wine glass beside the untouched napkin. "People confuse precision with cruelty," he said finally. "And are they wrong?" Claire asked gently. Nathaniel looked up at her again. The room around them continued moving, but their corner of the restaurant felt strangely still now, isolated from the noise and silverware and expensive conversations nearby. "No," he admitted quietly. "Not entirely." That answer surprised her more than anger would have. Powerful men usually defended themselves. Nathaniel sounded exhausted by himself instead. Claire noticed his wedding ring then. Simple platinum. Worn smooth with years. Still on his hand despite everything else. He followed her eyes toward it. "Most people are too polite to stare," he said. "I was not staring," Claire answered calmly. "I was noticing." Nathaniel let out a faint breath through his nose, almost another laugh. "There is a difference. A large one." Before he could respond, the pianist near the fireplace shifted songs again. This time the melody changed into something softer and older, carrying through the restaurant with melancholy warmth. The effect on Nathaniel was immediate. His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. His fingers stopped moving around the bourbon glass. Claire watched him carefully. "That song matters too," she said quietly. Nathaniel did not answer right away. Rain shimmered across the windows behind him, while distant traffic lights reflected in his pale blue eyes. "My wife used to play it," he said at last. It was the first personal thing he had offered her all night. No rehearsed authority. No polished billionaire mask. Just truth. Claire lowered her voice instinctively. "Was she a pianist?" Nathaniel stared toward the empty chair beside the second wine glass. No, he said softly. She was the only person in this city who was never impressed by me. The confession lingered quietly between them while rain continued sliding down the windows of Valmont House in silver ribbons. Claire noticed the way Nathaniel Graves looked toward the empty chair after mentioning his wife, not dramatically, not like a man performing grief for sympathy, but like someone checking whether a ghost was still sitting there after all these years. The piano near the fireplace softened into another melody while servers carried steaming plates through pools of amber light. Around them, Manhattan's elite continued discussing acquisitions, elections, and vacation homes as if the world could always be organized into numbers and signatures. But at table 7, something invisible had shifted. Nathaniel rested his hand against the bourbon glass without drinking from it. Everyone in this city was impressed by me, he said quietly. Investors. Politicians. Magazine covers. They looked at me and saw power. He gave a faint shake of his head. Evelyn saw through me in under 5 minutes. Claire listened without interrupting. Most people rushed to fill silence because silence forced them to confront themselves. Claire had learned years ago that silence often revealed more than conversation ever could. What did she see? She asked softly. Nathaniel looked toward the rain beyond the windows again. A man who thought control could fix everything. Another pause followed. She used to hate this restaurant. Claire glanced around the dining room with mild surprise. Valmont House was legendary in Manhattan. Reservation lists stretched for months. Celebrities and billionaires fought quietly for the best tables beneath the chandeliers. Nathaniel noticed her expression. She said places like this made loneliness look expensive, he murmured. The sentence settled heavily in Claire's chest because she understood exactly what he meant. Across the room, the bartender stopped polishing glasses just long enough to stare toward table 7 again. Nobody had ever seen Nathaniel Graves speak this long to a server before. Usually dinner at this table involved clipped orders, impossible standards, and a silence sharp enough to cut through the room. Tonight felt entirely different. Claire noticed something else too. Nathaniel had still not touched the second wine glass. It remained perfectly aligned beside the empty chair like part of a ritual nobody else was allowed to disturb. Then why keep coming here? She asked carefully. Nathaniel's jaw tightened faintly. Because it was the last place I heard her laugh. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. There it was again. Not arrogance. Not cruelty. Grief buried so deeply it had hardened into routine. Nathaniel looked at her suddenly, studying her expression with that same analytical intensity from earlier. You pity me now? He asked. Claire met his gaze calmly. No, why not? Because grief is not unusual. The answer caught him off guard. Claire continued before he could respond. Everybody loses something eventually. Most people just hide it differently. Nathaniel stared at her for a long moment, while soft candlelight reflected against the crystal glassware between them. Somewhere in the restaurant, a server laughed nervously too loudly before immediately quieting herself. The storm outside rolled deeper across the city skyline. You speak like someone older than 27, Nathaniel observed. Claire offered the smallest shrug. Loss ages people differently. For a second, Nathaniel looked as though he might ask another question. Instead, he reached for the bourbon again, taking a slower sip this time. His posture remained controlled, but the edge around him had dulled slightly, like a blade finally set down after years of being held too tightly. Claire noticed the pianist beginning another song near the fireplace. The opening notes drifted softly through the dining room before Nathaniel froze almost imperceptibly again. Claire recognized the melody immediately this time. So did he. Moon River, she said quietly. Nathaniel looked down at the untouched second wine glass. Evelyn used to play it badly on purpose, he admitted after a moment. She claimed perfect music sounded dishonest. Claire smiled faintly before she could stop herself. Nathaniel noticed instantly. What? He asked. Nothing. That was not nothing. Claire glanced toward the pianist. Your wife sounds like she understood something most people in rooms like this never learn. Nathaniel leaned back slightly. And what is that? Claire's gray eyes moved slowly across the polished dining room filled with luxury, expensive watches, and carefully rehearsed importance. Then she looked back at him. That being admired is not the same thing as being known. Silence followed her words. Not uncomfortable silence. The kind that arrives when truth enters a room quietly enough that nobody can pretend not to hear it. The words lingered between them long after Claire stopped speaking. Nathaniel Graves remained still beneath the amber chandelier while rain drifted down the windows behind him in soft silver patterns. Around table 7, the restaurant continued its carefully choreographed performance of wealth and elegance, but the atmosphere had changed again. The tension that once followed Nathaniel like a storm cloud was no longer sharp. It had become something quieter, heavier, human. Claire reached for the bourbon bottle to refresh his glass, but Nathaniel raised a hand slightly. "Leave it," he said. She nodded once and stepped back from the table. Most servers would have rushed to fill silence with politeness. Claire understood something most people did not. Some silences were not empty. Some were full of memory. Nathaniel stared toward the pianist near the fireplace while the melody of Moon River drifted softly through the dining room. His expression remained controlled, but Claire noticed the faint movement in his jaw again, the subtle tightening that appeared every time the music touched something painful beneath the surface. "She used to hum that song while cooking," he said suddenly. Claire looked at him quietly. Nathaniel gave a faint shake of his head as if surprised by himself. "Evelyn could not cook at all," he continued. "She nearly burned down our kitchen making pasta one Christmas Eve." The corner of his mouth lifted briefly before fading again. "But she refused to let me hire help because she said rich people forget how to live ordinary lives." Claire listened carefully while candlelight flickered softly across the polished table. "She sounds brave," she said. Nathaniel's eyes lowered toward his wedding ring. "She was annoying," he corrected quietly. "Fearlessly annoying." Another faint, almost smile appeared. "She used to tell me my meetings lasted too long because I enjoyed hearing myself sound important." Claire smiled slightly. "Was she wrong?" Nathaniel looked up at her, and for the first time all evening there was genuine warmth hidden beneath the exhaustion in his eyes. "No," he admitted. The honesty in that answer surprised them both. Near the bar, the manager whispered something urgently to the bartender while glancing toward table 7 every few seconds. The entire staff had stopped expecting disaster hours ago. Now they were witnessing something none of them understood. Nathaniel Graves was speaking softly, listening carefully, remaining at the table long after he usually demanded the check. Claire noticed his untouched dinner then. The short ribs had barely been touched since arriving. "You are not eating," she observed gently. Nathaniel glanced down at the plate as though he had forgotten it existed. "I lost my appetite years ago." Claire hesitated briefly before speaking again. "Then why order the same meal every month?" The question might have sounded intrusive from anyone else. From Claire, it sounded careful. Nathaniel leaned back slightly in his chair while thunder rolled low across the city skyline outside. "Because she ordered it on our last night here," he answered quietly. The truth settled heavily between them. Claire suddenly understood everything. The same table. The second wine glass. The untouched chair. The identical order every month. Nathaniel was not returning to the restaurant for comfort. He was returning because grief had trapped him inside a memory he could not leave behind. "How long has it been?" Claire asked softly. Nathaniel's pale blue eyes moved toward the rain beyond the windows. 4 years. 4 years. Claire could hear the exhaustion hidden inside those words. 4 years of repeating the same ritual. 4 years of expensive dinners beside an empty chair. 4 years of pretending control could silence loneliness. The pianist transitioned into another song near the fireplace, but Nathaniel barely noticed this time. His attention remained fixed somewhere far away. "Everyone thinks I come here because I am difficult," he murmured. Maybe I let them think that because it is easier than explaining the truth. Claire folded her hands loosely in front of her apron. And what is the truth? Nathaniel looked directly at her then, and for the first time since entering Valmont House, there was no billionaire mask left in his expression at all. Only grief stripped down to honesty. The truth, he said quietly, is that I kept hoping one night I would sit at this table and it would stop hurting. Silence followed. Deep enough that even the storm outside seemed distant for a moment. Claire looked toward the empty chair beside the untouched wine glass, then back at the man sitting across from it alone beneath golden light and fading music. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft enough that only he could hear it. Maybe pain stays when people build their lives around preserving it. The storm outside Manhattan had softened into steady rain by the time Claire spoke again. Water shimmered across the windows of Valmont House while distant headlights moved like blurred gold through the city below. Inside the restaurant, the dinner crowd had begun thinning slowly, leaving behind quieter conversations, half-empty wine glasses, and the low intimate glow that only appeared after 9 o'clock. Table 7 remained untouched by the rhythm of the rest of the room. Nathaniel Graves sat motionless beside the empty chair while Claire's words lingered in the silence between them. Maybe pain stays when people build their lives around preserving it. Nathaniel lowered his eyes toward the second wine glass again. His reflection trembled faintly in the crystal. You think I want to preserve it? He asked quietly. Claire answered carefully. I think grief becomes dangerous when people mistake it for loyalty. The sentence landed harder than she expected. Nathaniel leaned back slowly in his chair, and for a moment he looked less like one of the most powerful men in America and more like someone profoundly tired. The pianist near the fireplace stopped playing briefly as another musician quietly replaced sheet music beneath the dim lamp. Silverware clinked softly in the distance. Somewhere near the kitchen entrance, the manager whispered to another server, but Nathaniel barely noticed any of it now. His attention remained entirely on Claire. You speak about grief like you know it well, he said after a long pause. Claire looked down briefly at the folded linen napkin in her hands before answering. My mother died 3 years ago. Nathaniel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Cancer? Claire nodded once. Pancreatic. Nathaniel looked away immediately, toward the rain, toward the city, anywhere except directly at her for a moment. My wife too, he said softly. Silence settled between them again, but this silence felt different. Not guarded. Shared. Claire finally understood why his eyes carried that permanent exhaustion. Certain losses rewrote people quietly from the inside. Nathaniel rested one hand against the edge of the table while the pianist resumed playing near the fireplace. This time the melody was slower, heavier somehow. When Evelyn got sick, he murmured, everyone around me suddenly became very careful. Claire listened quietly. They lowered their voices around me. Smiled too much. Avoided saying the wrong thing. A faint bitter smile crossed his face. Power terrifies people when it cannot fix something. Claire watched him carefully beneath the warm chandelier light. Did anyone tell you the truth? Nathaniel looked at her directly again. Only Evelyn. Another pause followed. She told me I was trying to manage death like a business problem. Claire could almost picture it. $1 billion meetings. Corporate acquisitions. Men in perfect suits believing every crisis could be solved through enough control. Until life finally presented something money could not negotiate with. Nathaniel's voice lowered further. The night before she died, she asked me to promise something. Claire waited patiently. Nathaniel glanced toward the empty chair beside him. She told me not to become a monument after she was gone. His fingers tightened slightly against the bourbon glass. I think I disappointed her. The honesty in his voice struck Claire harder than anything else he had said all evening. Not because he sounded weak. Because he sounded sincere. Around them, Valmont House glowed softly beneath crystal chandeliers and expensive wine and polished marble, but suddenly none of it seemed important anymore. Nathaniel Graves had spent 4 years sitting beside an empty chair because somewhere inside him, moving forward felt like betrayal. Claire understood that feeling more than she wanted to admit. My mother used to say something similar, she said quietly. Nathaniel looked up. What? Claire's gray eyes reflected the candlelight between them. She said grief should remind people how deeply they loved someone. Her voice softened. Not become the only proof they ever loved them at all. Nathaniel stared at her in silence. The sentence seemed to move through him slowly, like someone opening a locked room he had not entered in years. Claire noticed his eyes drifting toward the untouched dinner plate again. Toward the second wine glass. Toward the ritual he had repeated month after month without realizing it had become a prison disguised as devotion. Then something unexpected happened. Nathaniel reached forward quietly and moved the second wine glass away from the empty chair for the first time all evening. Just a few inches across the table. A tiny movement. Almost meaningless to anyone else in the room. But Claire noticed immediately. So did the bartender watching from across the restaurant with stunned disbelief. Nathaniel looked at the empty space beside him for a long moment before speaking softly. Evelyn would have liked you, Miss Whitmore. Claire gave the faintest smile. She sounds difficult enough that I will take that as a compliment. And for the first time in 4 years, Nathaniel Graves laughed quietly inside Valmont House. The sound of Nathaniel Graves laughing was so unfamiliar inside Valmont House that several people turned instinctively toward table 7 before pretending they had not. It was not a loud laugh. Not careless or dramatic. It sounded rough from disuse, like a locked door finally opening after years without movement. Claire noticed the bartender freeze mid-polish behind the counter while the manager nearly walked into another server carrying champagne flutes. Nobody in the restaurant knew how to react to this version of Nathaniel Graves because none of them had ever seen it before. Nathaniel himself seemed slightly surprised by the sound. The faint smile lingered only briefly before settling back into something quieter, softer around the edges now. Evelyn used to say almost the exact same thing, he admitted. Claire rested her hands lightly against the back of the empty chair beside the table. Then she was probably very wise. Nathaniel glanced toward the chair for a long moment before finally speaking again. She was infuriatingly wise. Outside, rain continued falling over Manhattan while the traffic below blurred into ribbons of red and white beneath the storm. Inside the restaurant, candlelight flickered gently against crystal glassware and polished silver. The dinner crowd had thinned enough now that the room felt intimate instead of crowded, softer somehow, as if the entire city outside had faded into the background. Nathaniel studied Claire quietly beneath the amber glow overhead. You know what is strange? He asked. Claire tilted her head slightly. What? Everyone around me spent 4 years trying to help. His voice remained calm, but there was exhaustion beneath it now, deep and old. Therapists. Business partners. Friends. They all treated me like I was fragile glass. He looked down briefly at the bourbon in his hand. You are the first person who simply talked to me. Claire's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Most people are afraid of powerful men when they are hurting, she said. Why? Nathaniel asked quietly. Claire considered the question carefully before answering. Because pain makes people unpredictable. Nathaniel looked toward her again with that same thoughtful intensity from earlier. And you are not afraid? Claire shook her head gently. No, why not? The question lingered between them while soft piano music drifted through the dining room again. Claire glanced toward the windows where rainwater traced silver lines down the glass. Because powerful men are usually the loneliest people in the room. Silence followed instantly. Deep. Complete. Even the faint sounds of silverware and distant conversations seemed to disappear around them. Nathaniel stared at her, as though she had spoken something nobody else had ever dared say aloud. Claire held his gaze calmly, not challenging him, not pitying him, simply offering truth without fear. Nathaniel slowly leaned back in his chair. For years people had called him intimidating, brilliant, ruthless, impossible. Yet this young waitress standing beneath warm chandelier light had seen through him in a single evening with nothing except quiet observation and honesty. The realization unsettled him more than any boardroom confrontation ever had. Near the bar, the bartender whispered under his breath, "Jesus Christ," after overhearing enough of the exchange to understand the shift happening at table 7. Nathaniel finally looked away first. Not out of anger. Reflection. He glanced toward the empty chair again, but this time the expression on his face had changed. Less haunted. More tired. As if he were beginning to understand how much of his grief had hardened into identity. "You know," he said slowly, "I spent years believing that letting go of this pain would mean losing her." Claire listened quietly. Nathaniel's fingers brushed against the untouched second napkin beside the empty chair. "But maybe I was only afraid that if I stopped hurting, the world would move on without her too." Claire's voice softened. "The world always moves forward, Mr. Graves." Nathaniel gave a faint nod. "And people?" Claire looked directly at him. "The people we truly love do not disappear just because we finally allow ourselves to live again." The words settled heavily into the silence between them. Nathaniel lowered his eyes for a long moment, while the piano melody drifted gently through the nearly empty restaurant. Then, quietly, almost absent-mindedly, he reached across the table and folded the second unused napkin beside the empty chair. Another tiny movement. Another ritual breaking apart. Claire noticed immediately. So did the bartender watching from the shadows near the bar. Nathaniel looked toward her again after a moment. "What made you become a waitress?" he asked softly. Claire smiled faintly, but there was sadness behind it now. "Honestly? Always." She glanced around the elegant restaurant filled with crystal and gold light and expensive silence. "Because after my mother died, I needed somewhere the music was loud enough that I would not think all the time." Nathaniel stared at her quietly. Then, for the first time all evening, he truly understood that the woman standing beside his table had not been rescuing him from grief. She had simply recognized it because she carried her own. By the time the clock above the bar drifted past 10:30, Valmont House had softened into the quiet elegance that only existed after midnight crowds and business meetings disappeared. Most of the diners had gone home to penthouses overlooking Central Park or town cars waiting beneath the rain outside. Candle flames burned lower now. The pianist near the fireplace had switched to slower melodies that drifted gently through the nearly empty restaurant like distant memory. And at table 7, Nathaniel Graves remained seated long after he would normally have left. Claire Whitmore stood near the table holding the silver coffee pot while soft rain continued tracing silver lines down the windows behind him. Either of them spoke for a while. Somehow the silence no longer felt heavy. Nathaniel glanced toward the empty chair one last time before quietly reaching for the second wine glass beside it. Claire watched carefully as he studied the untouched crystal reflecting warm chandelier light. For 4 years that glass had remained exactly where it was, month after month, untouched beside an empty seat preserved like a shrine. Slowly, almost thoughtfully, Nathaniel lifted it and handed it to Claire. "You can take this one away tonight," he said softly. Claire accepted the glass without speaking. Across the restaurant, the bartender froze completely after hearing the sentence. Even the manager stopped walking for a second. It was such a small thing. One wine glass. One empty place setting. But everyone understood what it meant. Nathaniel leaned back quietly in his chair after Claire removed the glass from the table. The space beside him suddenly looked unfamiliar now, less like a memorial and more like an ordinary chair waiting for life to continue around it. He stared at it for a long moment before letting out a slow breath. "That feels strange," he admitted. Claire returned the glass carefully to her tray. "Sometimes healing feels disrespectful before it feels peaceful." Nathaniel looked at her with the same thoughtful expression he had worn all evening. "Where did you learn to say things like that?" Claire smiled faintly. "Hospital waiting rooms." The honesty of the answer settled softly between them. Nathaniel nodded once as though he understood more than words could explain. Near the fireplace, the pianist quietly began playing Claire de Lune again. This time Nathaniel did not tense. He simply listened. Rain shimmered beyond the windows while candlelight reflected against polished marble floors and gold-rimmed crystal. The city outside remained enormous and restless and indifferent, but for the first time in years Nathaniel did not feel entirely trapped inside his own grief. Claire placed the check discreetly beside him. Nathaniel glanced down at it before reaching for his wallet. The black card between his fingers probably carried more financial power than most people would see in several lifetimes, yet tonight it suddenly seemed like the least important thing about him. He signed the receipt quickly before sliding it back into the folder. Claire picked it up automatically without checking the amount. Nathaniel noticed. "You did not look," he observed. Claire met his eyes calmly. "You are not the kind of person who needs to prove generosity with numbers." A faint expression crossed Nathaniel's face then. Not pride. Recognition. Like someone hearing dignity spoken fluently after years surrounded only by performance. He stood slowly from the table, adjusting the sleeve of his charcoal coat while soft piano notes floated through the restaurant. For the first time all evening, he looked lighter somehow. Not healed. Not transformed overnight. Just less alone. Nathaniel glanced once more toward the chair beside him before turning back to Claire. "You know," he said quietly, "every person in this restaurant spent years trying not to upset me." Claire tilted her head slightly. "And?" A faint smile touched his face again. "You were the first one who was not afraid to." Claire folded her hands loosely in front of her apron. "Some people do not need protection from discomfort, Mr. Graves." Her gray eyes held his steadily beneath the warm amber light. "Sometimes they only need someone willing to tell them the truth." Nathaniel stood silent for a moment, while rain tapped softly against the windows behind him. Then he gave a slow nod, the kind people make when accepting something difficult but necessary. He reached for his coat and turned toward the exit, but halfway across the dining room he stopped beside the pianist. The older musician looked up nervously, clearly expecting criticism. Instead, Nathaniel simply said, "Thank you for playing tonight." The pianist stared in stunned silence as Nathaniel walked toward the front doors of Valmont House beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Claire watched him disappear into the rain-soaked Manhattan night before finally opening the leather check folder left behind on the table. Inside was a generous tip far larger than anyone in the restaurant had ever received from Nathaniel Graves. But it was not the money that made Claire stop breathing for a second. It was the handwritten note beneath the signature. In sharp, elegant script it read, "Thank you for speaking to me like I was still human." And beneath the warm lights of the nearly empty restaurant, while soft piano music drifted through the silence and rain shimmered across the city outside, Claire Whitmore smiled quietly to herself because sometimes the loudest people in the room were only waiting for someone kind enough to hear the silence underneath them.